So this is our regulations panel, and we have Lisa Ellman. She is our moderator. She is an icon in this industry. She is a partner at the Hogan Lovells law firm and also one of the leaders of the Commercial Drone Alliance.
All right. Thank you so much, Don. Thanks so much for having me. Great. Very grateful to be here with you all. My name is Lisa Ellman, as Don said. So I founded Commercial Drone Alliance, an independent organization focused on moving the commercial drone industry forward, and serve as the head of a partner at Hogan Lovells and lead our global UAS practice group. So how many here are attorneys? Okay, great. Lots of us. And how many here are in the industry, like manufacturers, operators, end users? Lots of folks. Okay. And what about federal government folks or state or local government folks? Okay, great. We have a great mix here, and we want this to be engaging. So definitely want this to be a conversation. We have a very distinguished panel here today to talk about, kind of lay the foundation for the rest of the day. Delivering the goods, essentially where we are on the regulatory frameworks, as well as where we need to be, because as all of us in this room know, the technologies have moved very quickly forward and the policies and regulations have somewhat lagged behind. And we're starting to see a little bit of progress, but at the same time, in order to maintain and enhance our U.S. global leadership in advanced aviation, we need to make progress on the policy and regulatory side. So we're going to dig in there, and we're going to focus on the drone delivery use case for the purpose of this panel. So where I want to focus today is how we get our industry to scalability, because over the last decade, we've collected lots of data. I see some folks in the Beyond program here. Maybe some test sites. We've had lots of amazing pilot programs and testing and kind of, very geographic specific approvals, and where this industry needs to go and where we want to go as a national security and economic imperative is to scalability. And the question is how we get there. And I think, as Abby mentioned earlier, everyone in this room has an important role to play. It's not just the federal government. It's not just industry. It's not just academia. It's not just lawyers. It's all of us working together to get there. So, we're going to hear about, I want to hear about kind of, from Grant, what's going on with DroneUp and Walmart. I know Zipline is operating, of course, all over Africa, all around the world, in addition to North Carolina, expanding into Michigan, they just announced. Google's Wing, Alphabet's Wing is in Dallas and Virginia, and of course, Australia, where they have been able to scale. Amazon is expanding in California and Texas, and lots of companies are, so far it's been geographic specific in terms of bringing drone delivery to the American people. So, Grant, let me turn to you so you can give folks a status update of what Walmart and DroneUp are up to.
Thank you, Lisa. So DroneUp, we perform drone delivery a little bit differently because of our partnership with Walmart. As everyone in this room may or may not know, the biggest issue, in my opinion, that's impeding scalability is BVLOS, being able to operate beyond the visual line of sight of the pilot and command. Well, because roughly 9% of America lives within 10 miles of a Walmart, we are in a position where we can actually perform deliveries under Part 107. Caveat being, we cannot fly BVLOS. So that works to an extent because so many people live near a Walmart. However, it by no means is a long-term solution. And while we are collecting great data and we're enjoying, providing the American people with a taste of drone delivery, we agree with, pretty much everyone that the true future of this industry and scaling this industry is being able to fly BVLOS. Right now, we're in 34 locations, mostly Florida and Texas. Of course, we started in Walmart's home state, Arkansas. We're also in Utah, Arizona, and Virginia. So we are really enjoying the reactions we are receiving from the American people. I cannot stress enough how important community engagement and public acceptance is. you hear a lot of people complain about new technology until they taste it, until they get a taste of that 30-minute delivery, and then it goes out the window. That being said, there is no substitute for safety. Safety is absolutely our highest concern, that in conjunction with public acceptance. So I see what we're doing as kind of a taste of what's to come, but we look forward, along with the rest of the industry, to being able to perform these deliveries on a far more scalable level.
Great. Thanks, Grant. And Colby, of course, your company is creating some of the technology that will help with that scale. So can you talk a little bit about what you're doing on this front?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I had mentioned before, we started on our journey as a Lance provider, so enabling those recreational Part 107 operations. What was really interesting about that activity is we found that we're essentially the interface. We're where the rubber meets the road, I guess you could say, in terms of applying these regulations to operational procedures. That puts us in a really unique position. That it gives us insight in terms of some of those maybe finer points when it comes to the regulatory concerns or those new regulations that are coming down the line, like maybe from the BVLOS ARC. And it allows us to start positioning some of the data and the technology that's necessary to be able to support these operators and these beneficiaries. But also, and I really want to stress this, Grant made a really good point in community engagement. What are the things that you can do to start enabling them with an understanding of these regulations and their roles and their responsibilities that are in harmony with the FAA's vision in terms of BVLOS? And so that's a big part of what we're building into our technology. And working with all those stakeholders so they can all come together in a single environment and contribute, again, to the success of UAS.
Great. Thanks, Colby. And I completely agree that community engagement is critical. At some point, though, that it needs to be connected to the ability to operate in a community, because we can't go to a community over and over and over again and say, this is coming, really, this is coming. And people will stop listening, right? So we need to move the community engagement forward alongside the policy and regulations in order for folks to really engage and pay attention. So let's talk about this. Some of these scalability rule updates. We, of course, heard about Beyond Visual Line of Sight. As we all probably know in this room, last year, the Beyond Visual Line of Sight Aviation Rulemaking Committee issued its report. The agency is looking at this kind of, term Part 108. Kevin, I know you can't talk about the rulemaking in particular, but can you talk a little bit about what the ARC was tasked to do and what the FAA kind of learned from the ARC recommendations?
Sure. So how do I talk about potential future rulemaking while keeping my job?
Yeah.
Right? Okay. I think I can do this. The United States, we have the most complex and simultaneously safest airspace system in the world. And that's not by accident. That's through the work of everybody in a room like this, operators across the country, regulators. How many people flew in to Denver for this conference? Okay, and I'm going to regret this next question. How many of you were concerned your plane wasn't going to make it? Really?
I had a very big delay as well.
Other than Grant's delay, the majority, thank you, Grant, of hands went. Yeah. Yes, Grant. Okay, all right. So that's our goal. As Abby has mentioned, safety is our North Star. That's where we want to keep this going forward. So when we look at things like BVLOS and what can we do and what is the ARC tasked to, this is something that the FAA is keenly aware of. We understand under Part 107, BVLOS doesn't happen without a waiver. We also understand that's not scalable, that's not repeatable, and that's not going to further operations to where we need to go. So the ARC was formed as one of the first steps, and Abby's talked about another ARC that's forming. These are wonderful groups organized where industry, government officials, where we come together and try to have the best ideas on how this could work. And just about every facet of industry is represented on the ARC. There was general agreement on the ARC for most things. If you haven't read the ARC, I highly recommend it. If you're pinched for time, at least read the executive summary of it, because it's got a lot of good things in there. There was some disagreement on some things, but generally speaking, the ARC wants us to move forward with, and I think you mentioned a Part 108, although don't quote me on that, but they wanted some additional regulation to make this normal, repeatable, scalable, and I'll say safe so that we can move forward with this industry. So right now, the FAA is taking a look at that ARC. We've been looking at it for just about a year, maybe a little over a year. That's all part of the process. I have to say if, you understand, if we do come out with some rulemaking on this, it will go to a notice of proposed rulemaking, just like we did with the remote ID. I wonder if we'll get 53,000 comments on it, but nonetheless, everybody will get a chance to comment on it. But we are looking at all of these options, the lessons we learned from IPP, PSP, the Beyond program that's happening now, the work that's happening right now through Part 107 waivers, all that factors into how do we make this work? Because we fully recognize in order to move forward, we have to have repeatable, scalable, and safe BV loss operations.
And I would mention, thanks so much for that, Kevin. As the ARC Phase 1 report describes, and if you haven't read the Phase 1 report, I would suggest everyone in this room read the Phase 1 report. It's about the benefits of UAS technology as well as this, kind of the community interests. But it really outlines why moving forward on this rulemaking is so important. But we talk about safety as our North Star, and we absolutely agree. And in many ways, enabling drone technology will enable a safer transportation system. Use, aerial agriculture is one example. 2020, 13 agricultural deaths from spraying operations that year. Replace those operations with drones, and all of a sudden those fatalities go away. So we're also, safety and innovation are two sides of the same coin. We need to innovate in order to move safety forward. Great. So thank you very much for that, Kevin. And you mentioned some of these waivers in the short term that are kind of moving forward and providing some relief. Colby, do you want to talk about some of that from your perspective?
Yeah, while the ARC committee is meeting and doing their work and trying to line up those regulations, there still are avenues for the UAS operators to be able to conduct beyond visual line of sight operations. And so one of the things in our role that we do to enable those operators is get a better understanding of what it is they're trying to achieve, the area that they're trying to achieve it, and help them better define some of those details that the FAA would like to see within their request. And giving clarity in terms of the details of that operation, some of the safety concerns that may be in there, and the mitigation measures. So what we've seen in going through that process, and I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, but I really do enjoy reading the waivers. If you haven't had a chance to read those, the FAA does post those. And there's a lot of good insights in terms of different approaches that you can take to be able to successfully receive a waiver from the FAA. But if there's one thing that we've seen along the way in the process and in our role is, more often than not, there's a human on the other side of that proposition with the FAA. And really, it's really really important to set a rapport and build that relationship, with the FAA and going through that process and really have an understanding of what they're trying to do and what their motives are and what their focus is. And we've seen that if the operator is doing due diligence and really listening and thinking about what the concerns are from the FAA, the better the odds that those are going to be exchanged and communicated, and that there's going to be success in being able to receive that waiver. And so we're seeing that uptick. Like if you go through and read some of the most recent waivers, you'll see that there's commonality, right? There's a bit of a trend that operators are starting to learn from each other and take a common approach. And that's one of the things, again, that we try to support is not only guiding them, hey, don't reinvent the wheel, but also enabling them with maybe the data or the information or the context or lessons learned to be able to receive those waivers.
Absolutely. And one trend that we're seeing kind of across applicants is in terms of the FAA kind of developing some almost like standard scenarios where if you follow this type of ConOps, you'll likely get approved, is around obstruction shielding.
That's right. So
anyone want to talk a little bit more about that? I'm happy to if you, Colby, you want to go for it?
I'll go again. If nobody else. Okay. Yeah. So obstruction shielding, this is essentially using critical infrastructure to your advantage, right? So if you can operate within an area, infrastructure inspection is a really good example of this. If you can operate within an area and prove that you're going to stay within general proximity of a feature on the ground like a bridge or any other type of infrastructure, then odds are that's going to ensure that there won't be any other aircraft within that area on account of the fact that you're in proximity with an obstacle that they would like to avoid. So I'm not sure if that's what you're getting at, but and again, like the critical infrastructure inspection is one good use case for that type of proposition.
And the idea there, right, is that if a crewed aircraft is flying within 100 feet of a power line, there's bigger issues there than the drone.
That's right. Yeah, right. I don't think they want to occupy the same space as the power line. Exactly.
But we are really starting to see some progress there. If you check the Waiver website, you'll start to see some exciting news there. So we've been talking a lot about what has to happen on the FAA side. Let me just mention one thing. So Commercial Drone Alliance just recently participated in a listening session with the FAA around this Part 108 or this broad rulemaking. And there were at least 3 issues that were kind of raised as the FAA is really thinking about that no decisions have been made yet. And I just want to, you all have lots of intelligence and brain power here in this room. I want you all just thinking about this. The first one was whether to mandate UTM for any kind of category of beyond visual line of sight operations that would be enabled via rule. The second one was around environmental, because there are a lot of environmental requirements on the FAA when they do rulemaking, and kind of some of the arguments behind that, given that UAS are a generally clean green transportation solution. And the third was around, I would call a shared and collaborative airspace. Others might call right of way. So enabling a shared and collaborative airspace. So as you all may know, if you've gone through the exemption process or the waiver process, one challenge that you face is the ability to get to yes when there are non-cooperative aircraft out there, meaning non-cooperative crewed aircraft in there, not even though they might not be following the rules and non-cooperative. So this was, Kevin mentioned that all of the ARC report we had consensus, but this one kind of sliver, but it's a very important sliver of the ARC report, did not have consensus among all the stakeholders. And this is something that the Hill is focused a lot on right now, that the FAA is focused a lot on right now. And I would kindly suggest that we're all focused a lot on this right now, because it's incredibly important. You can have a perfect beyond visual line of sight rule, but if it doesn't anticipate a shared and collaborative airspace where we're all talking to each other and communicating, it's going to be very difficult for us to be able to scale. So happy to talk to you all offline about that, but I just wanted to raise that as an issue, and I know Kevin can't really talk about it. So thanks for that. Okay. Yes. Belinda, we've been talking about the FAA, but the FCC is another critical stakeholder here, and communications technology is critical here. Can you give us a status update on where things stand there?
Sure, absolutely. And it feels like the magic word of the day is safety. And in order to have enhance the safety of UAVs, the communications have to be safe. And so currently, the communications between base stations and the UAVs take place on Wi-Fi or Bluetooth for the most part. And there's not a lot of protection for UAVs as they operate in those systems, because they're not protected from interference. For harmful interference, they don't have priority. And so what the FCC is looking at, they issued a notice of proposed rulemaking, and they sought comment on opening up or designating the 5 gigahertz band, the spectrum, for UAVs. And enabling this to happen will actually enhance the safety that we've been talking about here. And so the comment period has closed, and what the rulemaking was looking at is designating the spectrum for communications between not only, between base stations and the drones themselves, and particularly to enhance communications, for example, for remote ID. I don't know, we're going to talk a little bit about that later as well. There's opportunities to enhance that capability. And the FCC is working closely, having learned the lesson from prior experiences with NTIA and FAA to make sure that they get this right. And this is just the first step, opening up the 5 gigahertz spectrum. There will be other steps, I think, again, working alongside the other agencies and the industry to identify ways to enhance and make sure that the communications are protected for the drones. Mm-hmm. And they have not signaled when the final rulemaking will be released. I anticipate they're working on that right now. The FCC has recently established a new bureau, a space bureau, that is designated mostly for satellite services. But again, they will, I'm sure, also have some insight into the use of this spectrum, which again, some of the actually satellites use this spectrum as well. So that's what's going on at the FCC.
Great. Thank you, Belinda. Very helpful update. So obviously a lot going on the executive branch side. We just mentioned a few examples here, but we're here at a very unique time. Once every 5 years, there is an FAA reauthorization on the Hill where Congress gets to tell the FAA what to do. So Grant, Belinda, Colby, would you like to share with us what you'd like to see in the FAA reauthorization, or any kind of thoughts you have where it's important that Congress speak during this process?
So, point of clarification, when he asked if anyone was concerned they weren't going to make it, I was concerned I wasn't going to make it because my flight kept getting delayed. I had no concerns about the safety of the aircraft, just to clarify. So, I was concerned I'm not going to be here this morning, but I am, and I'm thankful for that. So, with this reauth, I think it's so very important. We're sharing that entire mechanism with the entire crewed aviation industry. And what we see is from the 2018 Act, there are still provisions of that have not been implemented yet. And members of Congress have expressed their frustration at that. So I think keeping the pressure on the Hill to just make sure there's adequate UAS representation in that act is critical. Otherwise, we really stand to get lost in the weeds, and we don't need that at a time when we are falling behind other countries, just in terms of what you're able to do with BVLOS, especially with BVLOS. So I think it's critical that we keep UAS as much as possible at the forefront. And this is a little beyond this question, but I assume we'll talk about the current Thune-Warner legislation. Yep. So you want me to let them finish that? Talking about reauth first?
Sure. Okay. Yeah, we'll talk about reauth broader, then get to Thune-Warner.
Sure. Yeah, I think I'm with Grant there, is just keeping UAS and autonomy top of mind. And I think there's an opportunity to be able to engage with some of those senators and representatives and informing them about what this is and the role that they can play, and some of the things that they might be able to contribute that builds upon the successes that the FAA has had initially in integrating UAS into the NAS. And I think more than anything that calls for working with their staff and giving them a better understanding of what this means, not just generally like in terms of the NAS, but what this means in terms of what's important to them and their constituents. There's a lot of that the UAS has to offer in terms of those interests of concern for those elected officials, whether it's electrification, whether it's carbon emissions reduction. There's even equitability plays into this. So I think the more that they see that it's very relevant in terms of their interests and concerns, the more the door opens for them to kind of gather that information and have better context when it comes to making those decisions with the reauth.
And one thing I wanted to, aside from the reauth, one thing I wanted to comment on is also engaging the agencies. Clearly, the FAA is well represented here, but there are also other agencies that are all involved, NTIA, FCC, that I also mentioned. And getting before them and educating them is very key. They have a lot of, different priorities before them, and you guys are the experts on what you're doing. So anytime you're doing something new and novel, it's important to get before the agencies and explain to them, and the right folks there to explain to them what you're doing. And obviously, these are lovely people. They try to stay on top of what's going on, but it can be very challenging. Again, having been at an agency for 24 years, it can be challenging, and it's always welcomed for the experts to come in and explain what's going on and provide your perspective. Because when the time comes to when something is authorized and they're told you've got 6 months to act, they will be ready to act in an appropriate way because they will be well informed.
Yes, that is absolutely correct. Now, getting back to, so on FAA reauth in terms of telling the agencies what to do, and I would also, by the way, Belinda, add the national security agencies. We'll talk in a bit about remote ID, but they're, of course, very relevant agencies in terms of being educated on this. FAA reauth. So one of the, I think, great things about this FAA reauth season, and I'm looking now at Scott, Commercial Drone Alliance has been working hand in hand with AUVSI as well as Small UAV Coalition. The Hill wants the UAS industry to be united, and I think we have a really great partnership between our groups, which I think has gone a long way. And I would encourage all of you in this room as well to work together, whether through your associations or in collaboration, because if they see that the industry is splintered, they frankly will just kind of put it aside and not deal with it. And that's what we don't want to happen. There's going to be a UAS title or a UAS/AAM title, a new entrance title in this FAA reauthorization. And we want to be sure that we are presenting united front. Thune Warner is one example of that, where we worked hand in hand, Commercial Drone Alliance, AUVSI, Small UAV Coalition, worked hand in hand to actually collaborate to draft this legislation. Grant, you want to give some highlights from the legislation?
Sure. This legislation is really near and dear to pretty much everyone in the industry, but especially, well, I shouldn't say especially, the drone delivery operators are very interested in this legislation because it does several key things for our specific sector, but really and true for most UAS use cases. What this legislation does is it would require the FAA within 6 months of the passage of the act to implement a notice of proposed rulemaking to implement the BVLOS ARC, the provisions of the BVLOS ARC. And there's a provision in there that says if the administrator determines there's some segment of the recommendations that he doesn't agree with, he can not implement it, but he has to provide an explanation for doing so. I think that's the language or something like that. Once the notice of proposed rulemaking, once that rulemaking proceeding is finalized, I believe there's a 2-year implementation period. Isn't that right, Lisa? 2 years. And this is key because we're talking about actually implementing what we hope will become Part 108, these relaxed BVLOS regulations that will enable the industry to actually finally scale. What this legislation also does that is really important is right now, much of the industry is operating on what's called 44807 exemptions, but they're set to expire in September. This not only would this legislation allow those exemptions to continue to exist for a longer period of time, but they would also enable certain drone operators, including delivery companies, to apply for a 44807 exemption if they can do low-risk BVLOS operations, prove they can do low-risk BVLOS operations while we are waiting for Part 108 to be implemented. And this is key for DroneUp, but as well as for all drone delivery companies and the entire industry, because we really are getting to a point where it feels like we're constantly being stifled. And, the payoff to that is we have the safest, most complex airspace in the world. And when you have that, you're going to have to really prove the case in order to innovate and to show the regulator that you are ready for them to relax some regulations to allow you to complete more complicated use cases. And so the burden is largely on the industry, and we're ready to prove that. We're ready to show that we can operate safely. This legislation goes a long way in doing that. The other thing that's been kind of a headache for the industry is the type certification process. And what this legislation does is when Part 108 or whatever we're going to call it is enacted, it doesn't require a small UAV to have a special airworthiness certificate, be type certified, product certified, any of that, have a type or production certificate. And for larger UAVs, I think it does not require, you can get a special airworthiness certificate, but you don't necessarily need to go through the cumbersome type certification process that we've seen really kind of be a thorn in the industry side.
Yeah, it would basically implement the will of the ARC, right? No, absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Grant. And I'll add just 2 items. That was a wonderful summary of the bill. First, on the 44807 piece, it would renew 44807, which is important, but it would also improve 44807 because it actually includes a statement in there that 44807 shall not be a rulemaking. Who here has gone through the 44807 process? Okay. How, yes, of course. I know you've gone through it, Wendy. Yep. So, only a small portion of that process is actually focused on safety. It's a lot of, because it's an actual rulemaking, it has to go through like 10 other offices. A lot. I think 18 different offices have to review a 44807. And that includes an environmental review. It includes the chief counsel's office. It includes potentially DOT. It includes lots of different reviews that aren't focused on safety. And so the FAA has interpreted 44807 to require a rulemaking. There's nothing in the legislation that requires that. And so it essentially tells the FAA, you can do this as you do like the 44803C waiver for test sites. Like you could do this as a waiver process where certainly there has to be a safety review, but it doesn't also have to be this lengthy, year, 2 year, 3 year long rulemaking process, which does not actually enhance safety in any way. Number 2, you've heard a lot of talk about FAA reorganization. And the Thune-Warner bill also has a proposal in there around FAA reorganization. Obviously, the FAA has had its own proposals out there that would move UAS into next gen. The Hill wasn't happy with that. Industry wasn't happy with that. We're not a science experiment. We don't, we believe we're in the implementation phase. So the Thune-Warner bill would create an associate administrator for UAS integration that would also help to streamline, recognizing the status quo is broken, would help to really streamline approvals. And then it creates a certification unit in there and helps to fix some of the other challenges. So that's great legislation. The Senate seems to really like it. There's been some challenges on the House side. If you're speaking with members of the House side, please promote Thune-Warner. It's a great piece of legislation. We have only a few minutes left, and I want to get to questions. So let's first, but before I do, I just want to give you all a snapshot where things are with regard to remote ID and ops over people and moving vehicles. Remote ID, Belinda?
Sure. The FAA has implemented rules for remote ID. As you're aware, they will go into effect for operators later this year. And so if the UAVs themselves have the capacity to give certain information about their location, the type of vehicle that it is, and the time, the takeoff flight time, et cetera, share that information with the FAA. That is one requirement that they have. And the second requirement is if the drone itself is not equipped to provide that information, there's an opportunity to have a separate unit that can be attached to the drone to again provide certain critical information to the FAA. Again, this is to promote the safety and provide opportunities for BV loss operation down the line to make it better for the industry and provide the security assurances, the safety assurances that the FAA is requiring. And frankly, having those rules in place will allow, I think, individuals to feel more comfortable that as these drones are operating overhead, that there are safety precautions being implemented. And the FCC has also sought comment on whether the remote ID, again, currently the remote ID is the communications would take place over Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. And again, if you guys have had any issues, this has been great today for Wi-Fi, but if you have had issues in the past for, Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, you can understand how they're not as stable as having dedicated spectrum would be. And so having regulations and rules and having the spectrum set aside for that will actually, I think, really benefit the industry.
Great. Thanks so much. Kevin, can you talk a little bit about implementation from the FAA side?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. This has been a great conversation. So I'm learning a little bit too as I go along here. So with regards to remote ID, I think it's safe to say remote ID is here. This isn't something that's coming. It's not a proposed rule. It's not something that's marked on the calendar. Last September was a compliance date for manufacturers producing UAS to be sold in the United States to manufacture them with what we call standard remote ID. So that is the remote ID equipment's built into the drone itself. And the other piece that was mentioned here, what we call a broadcast module, with aftermarket, if you will, piece and add-on that goes with that. We did have a short period of what we call discretionary enforcement. I'm using that term very carefully, where certain manufacturers that were trying to produce these in good faith were given a little bit of extra time. It was about 2 or 3 months that they're given extra time to do that through December of 2022 to meet that requirement. That's not going to be happening for operators. This September 16th, is when the operational compliance date for remote ID happens. So that is, I checked with our legal counsel. I feel fairly confident, although maybe I'll get an email later. I feel fairly confident that date is not going to move. September 16th will be the operational compliance date. So beginning at that time, operating a UAS that requires registration, so we're excluding the 44809 rec flyer, 0.55 pounds or less, but it requires registration, is going to be required to broadcast remote ID unless you're operating in a FAA recognized identification area, which is a terrible name for an area you don't need remote ID, but they didn't ask me. So if you're operating in a FRIA, you wouldn't need one. But again, September 16th, that's the operational compliance date where everyone operating a drone effectively will need to be broadcasting that remote ID. So that date is coming up. And remote ID is really seen as a necessary stepping stone. We've talked about what we need for BVLOS, about safety, security. We also talked a little bit about UTM, what we're going to need for that. This all sort of packs into that future operational state where we can make these drone deliveries and everything that we want to do with drones normal, scalable, and safe.
While you're at it, Kevin, can you give us a sense of, obviously the ops over people rule is also being implemented. So can you talk about that from the FAA perspective? And then I want to talk about very quickly, because I want to move to Q&A, the practical implementation issues with both of those two rules, the remote ID and ops over people.
Sure. So we have the operations over people rule. It's been on the books now for probably a little over a year. If I think it kind of when we changed the night operation rule as well. But what you saw in Part 107 was a shift based on the information we learned about operating over people through waivers. We divided drones into 4 different types of categories. And I'm not going to go into the categorical definition. You can all take a look at that online. But essentially, depending on the drone's weight or perhaps the kinetic energy it could deliver upon impact, you'd fall into one of the 4 categories. Category 4 is sort of the oddball. I know you mentioned type certification, but a Category 4 drone would require an airworthiness certificate. But by rule, you can now operate drones over people if you meet the requirements of Category 1, 2, 3, or 4. Also dependent upon what category, and if you're going to loiter your drone over people, or what we call sustained operations over open air assemblies. Don't ask me to define either of those. But if you do any of that, that would require compliance with Part 89, also known as remote ID. So there is some remote ID elements that right now tie into the rule for operating over people. But again, starting September 16th, any drone that requires a registration is going to have to broadcast remote ID unless it's operating in a FRIA.
Great. Thank you so much. And if we have time, I want to get to the practical issues from the industry side. But first, let me just take a minute and see if any folks have questions. Yep.
So, it's nice to hear up front that public acceptance was talked about as a significant concern. Mark Over's video of zipline operations in Rwanda has 23.9 million views. My kids know about program. And I hear a lot of DC-centric FAA trying to speak with one voice, and my kids are asking me, why is this an acronym? Like, where is it an acronym? And so, where's the public acceptance that we point to almost a demand signal? Why doesn't Marlon just do a film in West Texas, even though he's Colorado?
You don't want to do that?
Yeah, and let me just describe like what the Mark Roper video is. Mark Roper is like a tech, kind of, he's very famous and put together this amazing video of Zipline's new platform in was it Ghana, Rwanda? In Rwanda. It's an incredible video. So for those who haven't watched it, I would suggest you all take a look. I agree, it's really gone viral, obviously millions of people. And this is a critical question because it's part of the U.S. leadership in global advanced aviation, where we need to act here. This is a national security and economic imperative. The video should be made in the US, but things have been so limited that we don't have that broad acceptance because it's kind of the chicken or the egg. You can only go to communities so many times and say, hey, isn't this really exciting? But then if you're not allowed to operate, they get excited over, and then they kind of stop paying attention. Grant, you have anything else to add there?
I think that one of the impetus with Tom Walker, our founder CEO, for him to try deliveries under 107, it was that very issue, was the fact that, we saw companies pursuing the Part 135 process, which is very expensive and time consuming. We saw, how great drone delivery was being received in other countries. And actually prior to that in America, there were anecdotal evidence of how well it was received from our competitors as well. So our competitors did a great job earning that public trust under what they could do under Part 135. So I think really anyone who learns about it, sees it, they instantly fall in love with it. I know that sounds very, very trite or whatever, but it's true. Anyone who actually experiences a drone delivery firsthand, and when it's done safely and correctly and in compliance with the regulations, they love it and they want more of it. They want their Oreos or their hamburger helper. We're working on makeup. Nail polish is currently excluded because anyway, that's a whole other story. I know makeup's a problem for us right now. We're working on that though. But no, it's people fall in love with this technology. The louder they become, when I say louder, I just mean the more they show an acceptance of this technology, I'm confident the more that the executive branch and legislative branch will work together to make it a reality.
Absolutely. I mean, Congress is reactive, and if they hear that public demand, and just to be clear, we've been talking a lot about the regulatory and policy challenges. There are a bunch of really great people across the federal government trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. It's not personal, right? They're really, really hardworking people who are just challenged by the current regulatory frameworks, which were designed for crewed aircraft, and they simply don't fit with this new technology. So it's a challenge for all of us to try to get to a framework that works. Yep.
So this is probably more of an operational question, implementation question, especially when remote ID gets in. But there seems to be a huge gap in the ability to enforce, especially at the SLTT level when it comes to, if we implement things like remote ID, and the whole point of that is to make, safer areas of flight. Does the FAA have the data sets to, take on all of the information that's being exuded from remote ID that's being broadcast? If so, what is the plan, I guess, for either lead agents or on-the-ground personnel to enforce some of those policies? Because right now, I feel like there isn't a lot of authority at the state level.
Sure, that's a great question. And the second part of your question of how are we going to use remote ID or how are we going to enforce this really is going to rely on the partnership we have with our law enforcement communities. We are straining right now to hire what we call aviation safety inspectors, those folks that go out to do observations, surveillance, and if necessary, enforcement. It's the economy is great. Nobody wants to work for the government when the economy is great, so it's tough to get people to come in. So could we have an aviation safety inspector at every corner to monitor that? No way, not going to happen. So then what it gets to is what you mentioned, our law enforcement assistance program, or LEAP. We have our aviation security and hazmat group manages those LEAP agents that connect with our law enforcement officers. In fact, we just released a 3-part video series to help law enforcement officers understand how we can help them and how they can help us when it comes to remote ID. Because as many of you know, when remote ID was rolled out, it was missing one of the key proposals that the FAA brought forward, which was a network requirement. That got dropped. I think 52,999 comments out of 53,000 said get rid of it. So we took it away. We listened. So part of that is the locality of remote ID. It's not something that you're going to go on your computer and see every drone flight across the country, right? So that enforcement relies on a significant level of partnership with our law enforcement communities. And we have a lot of outreach that happens. Drone Responders is a group that we work with quite a bit. We have a whole group dedicated to law enforcement. So it's a challenge. There's no question. We're not going to catch every bad actor out there, but we certainly are doing everything we can within our power, within our human resource capital to ensure that remote ID works, that is implemented correctly, and that keeps people safe.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Thanks for that great question. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so I'll just conclude for our panel. This has been a fantastic panel. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but we will be around. Happy to talk offline. And I look forward to working with all of you to make scaled commercial drone delivery operations in the United States a reality. Thank you.
All right.